going to talk about the brain. This is our third partition in this particular series. We're going to talk about memory and how evolution miraculously had everything work perfect so that we can have memory. Or God created us in His image, and this is what He gave us instantaneously. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So to do that, I would like to start in prayer. So why don't we take a couple minutes here and just give it to God. Well, Heavenly Father, we thank You for this wonderful night. The day has been beautiful. We're blessed to be here under a roof where we can talk about You, Lord. So may the glory be to You tonight. May we all understand the glory and what You have done with the human body, and most importantly, the intricacies You've built into our brain, so that we can remember the words that You gave us and all of the wonderful blessings that You've given us. So I ask for favor tonight. I ask that each one of these guys be blessed by Your words. May Your words be in my mouth. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
So, how many people can remember when they were 4 years old? How many people can remember what they had for dinner last night? We're making progress. We went from short term to way back long term. You can remember when you were 4?
Yeah.
How do we know that's actually true?
He was there.
I can remember 5.
Really?
Yeah. I can definitely remember 5.
So that's what we're going to talk about, is how can we do that? In some cases, that's, a little more than 20 years ago. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight, how it works, how God designed us. But before we go there, let's remember what BCS is about. BCS is about looking at the world through the lens of God, through the Word He gave us, and how it shows that God is real. And the whole point of this is so that we're not conformed to the world, but we can understand how His laws make everything work. So if we go a little further with that, the idea is that we can answer, and Bob's putting together something for middle schoolers, that science, which is objective, looking at the facts, making hypotheses, and trying to confirm whether those hypotheses are true or not, that's true science. We need to get our kids back that way. So we need to be able to answer questions like, how did that happen, as opposed to, did it evolve? And we're going to discuss that a little bit tonight. So in the beginning, as it says in Genesis, God created. We're not talking evolution. And what did He create? He created the heavens, the earth. He created the water. He created all living things. And then what did He do? He created us in His image. So if we look at His image, one of those things is memory. And if you want to think about it, if you don't have a memory, do you really even exist? Can you remember where you came from? So memory is very important from a perspective of remembering who God is, who God was, and projecting who God's going to be. So what does the Bible say about it? Here's an interesting verse. Luke 16:19 says, "Thought and memory happen in the spirit, not the brain." Think about that. What's the spirit? Is that of the flesh? Can you see it? Can you touch it? The answer is you cannot. And yet it is. Do animals have memory? Do flowers have memory? They're all created, right? Yeah. We have memory. Now, dogs may have some memory. The land animals may have some memory. But the question is, it's in the spirit. That's what the Bible says. It's in the spirit. Now, we have mechanisms which we're going to talk about today. But God says memory and thought come from the spirit. And if you recall in Romans, we communicate through our spirit, the groaning of our spirit, to God. So hopefully there can be some communication tonight to you guys about what mechanism God has put through in the brain, and we're still trying to figure this stuff out, to have memory, which creates thoughts, which you can speak, and depending upon which part of the world you're in, that memory is going to let you to communicate. So everything starts with memory. Thoughts start with memory, and that's from the Spirit of God. And can you touch that? No. One of those mysteries. So, wow, what's it been? It's 8 weeks?
Yeah.
8 weeks the last time we talked about the chemistry of the brain. So we're going to talk about neurons and memory formation. That's how it works. So a little review. Brain chemistry says we have these neural cells in our body. And some sensor within the body triggers something. Your eyes, your ears, your smell, the senses trigger something. Electrical cells are connected. There's a transfer of information from one neuron to another. And it's the process of these neurons connecting through a process of, shall we say, electrical connections that's going to create memories in our brains. And I'm going to have some experts kind of give a nice discussion of how this works, so you don't have to hear my voice the whole time. And then what happens is these neurons connect to other neurons through the synapse, or the connection between them, and as those connect, we'll find that's how memory is formed. So you have to understand there's chemistry, there's electricity, which are all innate things, and they're going to create living thoughts, smells, and senses that we have, that we can remember back when we're 5, when we're 4, what we had for dinner last night. Does anybody ever have a trigger, a smell or something triggers memories? Same thing. So one of the first things I want to do is talk about the brain and where stuff fits. So there's short-term memory in the front. There's verbal memory in this part down here. There's spatial memory, which puts things in together. And then there's visual memory behind the brain. So all these parts of the brain, which is nothing more than, cells, chemicals, and electricity, are going to make this miraculous thing of thoughts and memories that we have. So let's look at capacity. In your bulletin you saw that there's speeds in how fast the brain works. Well, that has to work from some object. So that's where memory is. Von Neumann in 1950 said there was about an exabyte of memory. Then we came and saw there's all these synapses happening per second. In other words, how fast can these synapses fire? And then in 1986 they determined this is how much memory you have. Now as man expands more and more into the brain, they're finding more and more functionality. But this just gives you an idea of capacity. Now 10 to the 16th synapses per second, if you look at 1 million flops, 1 million operations, that's 10 to the 6th. So this is 1 million times, 1 million times. So the brain operates very quickly. So some people say it's like a computer.
Memory can change the shape of a room, it can change the color of a car. And memories can be distorted. They're just an interpretation, they're not a record.
Our memories are a concept that makes us who we are. Here are 10 interesting facts about it. Number 10. Women's memory is enhanced by a deep voice.
I don't know what you're thinking, but I have to warn you, the Massey prenup has never been penetrated.
Researchers from the University of Aberdeen, King's College in Scotland, and McMaster University in Canada found that women were able to recall more information when given by a man with a deep baritone versus a man with a high-pitched voice. Male memories did not appear to be influenced by the pitch of a female's voice. Number 9. Looking away helps your memory. According to research from the University of Stirling in Scotland, by looking away from the person who asked a question, our memory is better equipped to kick in. It seems that human faces and expressions are mentally captivating to us and clutter our concentration. Number 8. 7 is the magic number. Ever wonder why telephone numbers are 7 digits?
Here's how to order.
Call 1-800-577-8038. That's 1-800-577-8038.
Pioneer psychologist George A. Miller theorized that our short-term memory can hold around 7 items before we begin to forget them. Number 7. Left-handed people have better memories, and so do their offspring, according to a 2001 experiment published in Neuropsychology. One reason may be because left-handed people and their family members seem to have a larger corpus callosum, which are the bridges of neurons linking the brain's 2 hemispheres. Number 6. Bad memories can be erased using electroshock therapy. Marijn Kruijs, a neuroscientist at Radboud University, Nijmegen, in the Netherlands, found that by deliberately timing electroconvulsive shocks, they could interrupt patients' memories of a disturbing event. Number 5. You can be tricked into remembering things that didn't happen. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus has performed many studies, including one where subjects were told they had met Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. This is impossible, since Bugs is not a Disney character. Approximately 20% of the participants truly believe the fake memories as their own. Number 4. Insulin helps promote memory. We all know insulin is vital to regulating blood sugar levels, but scientists have also discovered that sniffing insulin seems to help those suffering with Alzheimer's by improving their memory functions. More trials are needed, but experts feel results are promising. Number 3. You can grow your brain for better memorization. A study done with London taxicab drivers over several years showed that those who had been on the job the longest had grown a larger than normal hippocampus, the region of the brain responsible for memory. Number 2. Anomia.
The chicks of which birds are born grey but develop their distinctive colour from their diet of algae and crustaceans?
This is the technical word for when you're trying to remember something and it's on the tip of your tongue. Number 1. We have more storage in our brain than we need. Paul Riebert, professor of psychology at Northwestern University, says, the human brain consists of about 1 billion neurons, amounting to more than 1 trillion connections. If your brain worked like a DVR in a television, you would have to leave the TV running continuously for more than 300 years to use up all that storage.
So interesting, huh? The number 7. Marty, you understand the significance of 7 in the Bible, completeness?
Yeah.
It's amazing how our brain randomly can remember 7 things. Just randomly. And then it was talking about how you can be, if you mention stuff enough, you can fool the brain. A significant, what is it, 20% of the people will believe what they're told. We live in that age right now. So that's something that is interesting from a standpoint, did you know that about the brain? Now, let's talk about some unforgettable facts about memory. Because that was the brain, so now let's go to the point of interesting things about the brain, shall we say. So let's talk about the biology of the human brain. I mentioned there's chemicals, there is electricity. Does everybody remember where the hippocampus was? It's right in the middle. It's right where the two come together. So that's, in fact, they're coming to understand a little bit better where memory comes from, and I'm going to show that one of the last slides I do. But this seems to be the place where it all starts. And then it appears that it goes from here back into there as neurons are connected. I'm going to show you a slide about that in just a second, or a little presentation. But memory is acquired. If you notice, most memories, 15 to 25. That's when we remember, that's why people remember the good old days, right? The number 7 comes up again. So there's a lot of things that the brain has been put in place by God, and it's not by chance. So let's talk about how the brain works. Another little video for us.
You may not realize it, but your brain actually processes information in 2 very distinct ways. Like when you look at this photo, you instantly know she has blonde hair, is visibly angry, and likely has some choice words to yell. Without any effort, you experienced fast thinking. But if you look at the following problem, something different happens. Sure, you immediately know it's a multiplication problem, and you knew you could solve it if you had the energy, but didn't. If you do try, your muscles will tense, your pupils will dilate, and your heart rate will increase. Now, you've experienced slow thinking. These 2 systems of fast and slow thinking dictate much of our perception and reaction in life. Take these lines for example. It's clear that they're different lengths, but if you measure them, they're actually the exact same length. Even now that you know, System 1 or your fast thinking can't stop seeing the illusion because it acts automatically. A similar effect is seen here. Which figure is the largest? Again, they're all the same size, but the suggestion of perspective and depth causes your System 1 to interpret the picture as 3-dimensional, even though it's on a flat 2-dimensional surface. It's making quick work of the available information, and so your conscious System 2, or slow thinking, must compensate after the fact and choose not to believe your intuition or instinct. Want to see your System 2 in action? I'll show you a string of 4 digits, you read them aloud, then add 1 to each of the original digits. If the card reads 3795, the correct response would be 4806. We'll then go to the next card and you'll do the same, followed by the next card. Ready? Go. Few people can cope with more than 4 digits, but even harder is add 3. The interesting bit is that though your pupils would have dilated, you often become effectively blind when you fully engage System 2. Did you notice the color of the text change? Or how about the fact that the numbers completely changed when I put them off to the side? Listen to the following puzzle. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Chances are your System 1 intuition was yelling 10 cents, but this appealing System 1 answer we know is wrong. In fact, the correct answer is 5 cents. Even if you worked out the correct answer, you likely thought of 10 cents along the way. System 1 is trying to work out an answer as quickly and seamlessly as possible, which is extremely beneficial in everyday life. If every activity required full mental effort, it would be exhausting. But knowing this allows us to understand that not all of our first impressions are correct. How many animals of each kind did Moses take into the ark? So few people detect what is wrong with this question that it's been dubbed the Moses illusion. In fact, Moses took no animals, Noah did. Again, our brain invests as little resources as necessary so that things run quickly and smoothly. Because Moses is not abnormal in the biblical context, System 1 unconsciously detects an association between Moses and ark and quickly accepts the question. In a similar way, System 1 generates context without you knowing. Reading each of the following may seem fairly simple. A, B, C, Anne approached the bank, and 12, 13, 14. But your brain actually interpreted these ambiguous statements without you ever knowing. You could have read it as A, 13, C, or 12, B, 14, but your brain created the context unconsciously. Also, you likely imagined a woman with money on her mind walking towards a building with tellers, but if the sentence before this was, "they were floating gently down the river," the entire scene would have changed because bank is no longer associated with money. Without an explicit context, System 1 quickly generates one based on previous experience. In this case, you've likely visited more banks than rivers, and so the context is resolved accordingly. This ties into a concept called priming. For example, if I said wash, how would you complete this word fragment? Most would see soap, but had I just shown you the word eat, you'd be more likely to see soup. In this way, both eat and wash prime your thoughts. Though System 2 likes to think that it's in charge and knows what's going on, the truth is that priming effects have even been shown to affect and modify behavior. These arise in System 1, and you have no conscious access to them. If you'd like to learn more about the thinking systems in your brain, check out the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which covers it in great detail. I'll put a link in the description which you can check out. Got a burning question you want answered? Ask it in the comments or on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe for more weekly science videos.
So what do you think of that? Fooling your memory, right? There's fast, impulsive, and then there's methodical and mature. Constant battle, right? God put this in to survive, and yet as we get older, we now have to behave, shall we say, more maturely. What is mature? Making right decisions. God put this into each one of us, and we need to take advantage of that. So now let's look at the brain. Memories are a neural network. I'm going to show kind of how memory works in another video in just a second. But the way memories work, what they've been able to find out, and this is all relatively new news. People really don't understand all this stuff, and they're digging into more and more because they're trying to come up with, how did it happen, much less how did it evolve. Because everything we're talking about today, I want you to think about how that could have evolved. Because it either works or it doesn't. Complexity, right? So groups of neurons are primed to fire together in a pattern that's repeated over and over again. That's memory. We're going to talk about a little bit more what that means. 90% of what we remember is from when we learn from 7 to 9 years. So in the last 10 years, we've increased our amount of knowledge on the brain because of the tools, because of the capabilities of our instruments. We're starting to get a better understanding of how the brain really works. And the more they dig into it, the more they don't know. Which, if you think about an evolutionary process, that's really bizarre. Right? It should be very easy, very simple, and it should go to complex. It just keeps getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And we're not even looking at the chemical reactions that are going inside of all this stuff to make it happen. So now we look at, oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. So the more often information is thought about, and I'm sure you guys can all look at this, we saw the fast, slow. If you think about something over and over again, you're going to repeat the pattern. If you do it more recently, you're going to remember it. Then the question is, how do you remember it over a long-term period of time? So let's talk about the science.
Do you smell that? It smells like cinnamon and evergreen trees. It reminds me of something. It reminds me of this video Hank made about how smell triggers memories.
You're walking through a hardware store one day when all of a sudden you catch a whiff of something you haven't smelled in years. Somehow the scent of glue immediately takes you back to your kindergarten classroom and you spend the next couple of minutes wondering what happened to that kid who used to eat all that paste. You just experienced what's known as odor-evoked autobiographical memory. To put it simply, a smell made you remember something from your past, and it happened because of the way smells and memories are hardwired into your brain. Now lots of different cues, like sights or sounds or even someone describing something or telling a a story unrelated to your story, they can trigger memories. But memories linked to smells are often stronger and more vivid, and studies have shown that they also tend to be memories of your early life, often before you were 10 years old. Which is weird, because adults usually experience what's known as a reminiscence bump, where they don't remember much from before their adolescence. But smells are really good at bringing those memories back. These memories tend to be more perceptual rather than conceptual, so you remember a particular sensation rather than a bunch of facts about something that happened. And researchers have come up with some theories why memories triggered by smells are so odd. There's a big difference between the way your body handles sight, sound, taste, and touch, and the way it processes smells. Those other senses are all routed through the thalamus, the part of your brain that sends them off into the appropriate processing centers. But smells bypass all that. Once they're detected by receptors in your nose, the signal heads straight to your olfactory bulb, the smell-analyzing region in your brain. And that area happens to be connected to the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are parts of the brain that help handle memory and emotion. So it's possible that when you smelled that glue in kindergarten, the signal got tangled up with memories of building blocks and apple juice. And when you smelled it again later, you remembered not just the glue, but also some of the associated memories, like that weird kid who ate the paste. In 2013, a group of European psychologists tested this whole phenomenon using functional magnetic resonance imaging. First, they presented subjects with 20 different strong, specific odors, like garlic, whiskey, and leather. Then, for each person, they identified the two that elicited the oldest positive memories. Then, it was time to scan their brains. Each subject was presented with their 2 experimental smells, plus 2 generic control smells, flowers and citrus. They were also shown some verbal cues, which were just the names of the smells projected onto a screen. The researchers found that both types of triggers tended to activate the regions of the brain associated with memory. But while the verbal cues lit up parts of the brain that were responsible for processing smells, the smells themselves were more strongly connected to emotional processing centers. Some of the participants associated the smells with memories from before they were 10, while others remembered things from when they were between 10 and 20. And depending on which time frame the memories fell into, their brains tended to use different regions to recall them. The earlier memories lit up the orbitofrontal cortex, which is connected to perception. The later ones, on the other hand, tended to activate the left inferior frontal gyrus, which handles more conceptual memories. So, can you use your nose's superpowers to help you remember things for your next big exam? Probably not. Smells tend to evoke early perceptive memories of events, not concepts. So the scent of glue might make you remember playing with construction paper in kindergarten, but your smell memory will not help you memorize Maxwell's equations.
Okay, so now we know why smells trigger memories, but that video also brings up so many other questions. I know how you can remember things, but how do you make memories? And why can I remember kindergarten, but I can't remember being a baby? And if smells can't help me study for a test, is there another way I can hack my memory? Check out these 3 videos from Hank, Olivia, and me to answer these questions.
How do you make memories? Inspirational websites will tell you to spend time with the people you love. Travel websites will tell you to travel to beautiful places. And I'm just going to tell you to watch this episode of SciShow over and over and over again until it actually sticks in there. But if you ask a neuroscientist, they might tell you about a man named Henry Molaison. In 1953, Molaison had surgery to remove certain parts of his brain and lost his ability to form most kinds of long-term memory, changing our understanding of the human mind and memory forever. Up until the 1950s, we really had no idea how the human brain could convert an experience into a memory that could be retrieved and relived. Scientists had been trying to figure it out, but they didn't have access to fancy technology like fMRI scanners to let them look inside living human brains. Based on what they did find out from animal studies and the brains of people who had died, they thought that memories might be stored throughout the brain. That seemed to make sense because patients with injuries to different parts of their brains would sometimes develop amnesia. So they had no clue what they were about to do to Henry Molaison. When Molaison was a kid, he hit his head while riding his bike, and after that, he started having seizures. A lot of seizures, and severe ones. His doctors tried all kinds of different treatments, but in 1953, he was 26 years old, and none of those treatments had worked. But there was one more procedure they thought might help. A surgery to remove the part of the brain where the doctors thought the seizures were coming from. So they did the surgery, removing 2 finger-sized pieces of brain tissue from Molaison's left and right medial temporal lobes. The specific parts they took out? The hippocampus, the amygdala, and part of the entorhinal cortex. You might recognize some of those names because we now know that they are really important parts of the brain. But at the time, doctors had no way of knowing just how big of a deal removing them was. When Molaison woke up, he could remember his name and things that happened in his childhood, but he had what's known as anterograde amnesia. Basically, he couldn't form new memories anymore. The doctors weren't going to be able to give him his memory back, but for the rest of Molaison's life, they tried to learn as much from him as they could. The main thing they found out was that the hippocampus plays a big part in the formation and retention of certain kinds of memory. Researchers also learned that there are multiple kinds of long-term memory controlled by different parts of the brain. Long-term memories are not as long as you might think. Basically, it's anything your brain retains after about 30 seconds. And there are two kinds of long-term memories: declarative or explicit, and non-declarative or implicit. Declarative memories are memories that require conscious processing, and the kind that Melason lost the ability to form. These include episodic memories, like the memory of your 11th birthday party, as well as semantic memories, which are facts and ideas. Non-declarative memories, on the other hand, are memories of habit, like riding a bicycle or tying your shoes. After Melason's surgery, he couldn't learn new facts or remember new events. He'd meet a person and forget them as soon as they walked out the door. But his doctors discovered that the different kinds of long-term memory must depend on different brain structures, because Melason could still form non-declarative memories. For example, he could learn new motor skills, like tracing a drawing he was looking at in a mirror, and his reaction times improved with practice. For the rest of his life, Melason was studied by dozens of doctors. To protect his identity, he was referred to as HM in publications. But after his death in 2008, his name was publicly released for the first time, and the rest of the world began to understand just how much he had taught us. Even in death, Melason continues to help us learn more about the brain. His brain was donated to science so researchers could examine it more closely and better understand the effects of his surgery. At his death, his brain was removed and flash frozen before being cut into 2,401 microsections, super thin slices to be mounted on slides for experimentation. These sections were used to make a 3D recreation of his brain in 2014. From that, we've already discovered that Melason hadn't actually had his entire hippocampus removed, just most of it. But because it was cut off from the rest of his memory systems by his injury, this small part of the hippocampus couldn't help him regain his memory. So Melason may not have been aware of just how important he was to science, but his life and death are still teaching us about memory and the human brain.
Remember that one time when you were a baby? No, of course you don't. Because if you're a teenager or older, chances are you can't remember anything that happened before you were 3. The process of forgetting these really early memories is called childhood amnesia. It happens to pretty much everyone, and it has to do with the way our brains develop as we grow up. Childhood amnesia starts to set in between the ripe old ages of 8 and 9. Before then, most children can remember things that happened when they were really young, like visiting a family member or winning a teddy bear from one of those impossible carnival games. But the passage of time by itself isn't enough to explain childhood amnesia. After all, when you're 30, you can remember certain things that happened 20 years ago when you were 10, but when you're 20, you can't remember being an infant at all. Plus, we don't forget everything from when we were little. Some things like language or motor skills that we pick up stick with us. But we do tend to forget episodic memories, memories of specific events and details. So scientists think that childhood amnesia must have something to do with the way our brains change between infancy and adulthood. It turns out some parts of our brains don't finish developing until long after we're born. One of those parts is the hippocampus, which helps us form and store episodic memories. Even as adults, our brains are always producing new cells called neurons in the hippocampus. But when you're a young growing child, your brain produces a lot of new neurons a lot faster. So to see how brain cell growth affected memory, a research team from Toronto took adult mice and experimentally made their hippocampuses produce more new neurons. And it turned out that the mice became more forgetful. They seemed to lose memories, just like humans do with childhood amnesia. But when researchers slowed down the growth of new brain cells in young mice, those mice seemed to forget less of their mousy childhoods. So the question is, why would making new brain cells be bad for your memory? Well, it's not in the long term, which is why we can keep making new episodic memories as adults. But it seems like trying to fit all those new neurons into your hippocampus when you're young could cause a problem. The new neurons shuffle around with the old ones to form new memory connections, and this could make it harder for the brain to find where earlier memories were kept. It might even erase them completely. Still, not all of our memories are kept in the hippocampus, so this doesn't explain everything about childhood amnesia. There are other parts of the brain involved in memory, including the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So scientists are studying these to see if they also make different amounts of new neurons when we're children compared to when we're adults. We don't fully understand childhood amnesia yet, but we do know it happens to everyone. So if you can't remember your first birthday party, don't worry. Neither can anyone else.
You know those phrases that just seem to be ingrained in your memory from middle school? Like, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, Roy G. Biv, or 30 days hath September, April, June, and November? Sound familiar? These are different kinds of mnemonics. Shortcuts that we use to help us remember stuff, like the order of operations or the color of a rainbow. Turns out there are a lot of strategies to remember information when you need it most. Take the mnemonic, my very educated mother just served us nachos. The first letter of each word stands for a planet in our solar system, from Mercury to Neptune. Now, when you first think about it, mnemonics like this don't seem to be a very helpful memory trick, because you have to remember twice as much. like a weird sentence plus all of the names of the planets. But that's actually why they work. A simple way to think about memory is that we store information, kind of like sticking a file in a filing cabinet or those shelves of orbs in Inside Out, until we recall or remember it later. And researchers studying how people learn suggest that recalling information can be easier when it's connected to other information we already know. So you can imagine this model of memory like a web of files, where the ones with more connections are less likely to be lost and easier to recall. One influential theory, which was published in the British Journal of Educational Psychology in 1976, put learning in terms of different levels of processing. Basically, they suggest learning can fall on a spectrum of surface level processing, which is more like rapid fire memorization, to deeper processing, or linking new information to an information network, which leads to better recall. And with mnemonics, you're making more of these connections. Sometimes it's between random bits of information, like setting the periodic table to the tune of a song you know. But there are a lot of memory hacks that psychologists have proposed over the years and tested in research experiments. Not all of them will work for everyone in every learning situation. There are just way too many variables in real life. But they can be helpful. If you're learning new words, you can try using the keyword method, a term that was coined in the mid-1970s by researchers from Stanford University and studied frequently in the next couple of decades. This mnemonic can help people learn words in new languages by connecting how a new word sounds to a keyword in English, for example. Then, the English keyword is linked to a strong visual image that helps you recall what that new word means. So in Spanish, say you're trying to learn the word perro, which means dog. You might pick the keyword pear and imagine a dog holding a pear in its mouth to connect the two. The keyword method could also help with more complicated vocab in English. Like when you think of the word melancholy, you can picture a sad melon to remember the meaning. But what if you're a more spatial, visual learner? Then you can use the technique known as the method of loci, which was first described by ancient Greek and Roman texts and studied by psychologists from the 1960s until now. This strategy allows you to create a kind of mind palace, where you mentally walk through rooms in a building or some other familiar space, the loci. Along the way, you can visualize things like symbols that represent key points in a speech you're going to give, or meeting the US presidents in order. So when it comes to school, trying to memorize one fact at a time might not be the best study strategy. Instead, it might help to connect that new information to other things you learned, or even make some kind of story out of it. And finally, there's chunking, a theory first proposed by a Harvard psychologist in 1956 that is still studied today. It's basically when you learn a whole bunch of information and organize it into chunks that make sense. Like, instead of trying to memorize a sequence of 8 separate numbers, you can break it into 2 chunks that sound like years. So it feels like you have fewer individual things to remember, and it's easier to store and recall more information. And with more and more exposure to the information you're trying to learn, like when you're studying, the larger the chunks of connected information can become. There's no replacement for paying attention in class, taking good notes, and spending time studying when it comes to learning. But if you're having a little trouble remembering stuff, you might be able to use some mnemonics, because sometimes we need all the help we can get.
Mnemonics. I knew there was a way to help remember things, but that reminds me. Can you really train your brain with those games? Here's one more video about that very topic. Exercising your muscles helps keep your body strong and healthy, which is why lots of people think your brain works in the same way. There are so-called brain training games out there that say they'll improve your memory, attention, and reasoning skills, and eventually make your brain faster and healthier. Some even claim to help prevent the onset of dementia. The problem is, they don't really work. Brain training, or cognitive training, claims to rely on neuroplasticity, the idea that connections between neurons in your brain are plastic and changeable and can adapt to new things. For years, scientists thought only the developing brain was flexible that way, but eventually they figured out that even though many connections do become fixed during childhood, the adult brain is still surprisingly flexible. Studies on dementia and the aging brain show that losing that plasticity leads to cognitive decline, so brain training programs claim to stop, or even reverse, the loss by flexing your brain like a muscle. And we've known for a long time that practicing a specific task makes you better at it, like how the different levels of Mario Kart might get easier the more times you play them. The question was whether playing these games can make you better at doing other real-life things, like remembering names and appointments. In 2008, a group of scientists from the US and Switzerland published a paper in the journal PNAS that seemed to show that it could work. In the study, a group of young adults were tested on their ability to solve new problems. 35 of them were assigned to a control group and had no contact with the scientists, while another 35 had to track a square flashing on a screen while listening to a series of sounds. cells. They were tested on whether each square and sound matched the ones that came before. After several weeks, the researchers tested all of the subjects on their problem solving again, and those in the treatment group seemed to show a huge increase in their IQ. Lots of people were excited about that paper, which has been cited more than 800 times since then. Then, some scientists started pointing out that it was seriously flawed. For one thing, there may have been what's known as a placebo effect, where the treatment group knew they were supposed to improve at the tasks after training, so they did. And when other researchers tried to replicate the results, they weren't able to. Studies since then have shown that brain training can have an effect on your brain, but it's a lot more specific. One paper published in Nature in 2010 had over 11,000 people practice tasks meant to improve their reasoning, memory, and attention, but after 6 weeks, they'd only gotten better at the games themselves. Their new skills didn't translate to other tasks, not even similar ones. For example, even if someone practiced a card matching game, it didn't translate to improvements in their score on the Paired Associates Learning Test, a similar kind of matching test that's used to assess memory impairment. And when scientists have compared other studies on brain training, they've also generally found that it doesn't have a significant impact on cognition. The consensus is so strong that in 2014, 70 neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists signed a statement saying that there's no compelling scientific evidence that brain training games reduce or reverse cognitive decline. So does that mean brain training doesn't work at all? Well, not exactly. The issue is more how these brain training programs are advertised. They're wrong if they say that brain training improves brain health overall, but that doesn't mean it can't be helpful in some specific cases. In one rehab program that included skills training, practicing things like remembering names and counting change helped patients with Alzheimer's disease get better at those things. But practice paying your bills isn't such an exciting sounding video game, which might be why brain training companies aren't making those games. And it's not like brain training is a terrible thing. Unlike some other kinds of pseudoscience, it won't actively harm you. But these games aren't cheap. The brain training industry brings in over $1 billion a year, which is a lot of money for people to be paying for ineffective treatments. So, what can you do to protect your brain? For starters, we're still trying to understand the effects of aging on the brain and what causes dementia. We know that dementia and memory loss are related to damaged neurons in the brain, but scientists aren't totally sure how the neurons get damaged in the first place, so we don't know any surefire ways to prevent or treat memory loss. Still, research has shown that there are some things that can help without an expensive subscription to a brain training program. More education translates to a decreased risk of dementia, and maintaining a healthy diet and getting lots of exercise can also help keep the aging brain healthy. Scientists might eventually develop an easy, fun way to protect your brain and make you smarter, but these brain training games aren't going to do it.
Okay. What did you notice about that video? Anybody?
Young people.
Well, I understand that, but there's something more specific I'm looking for. What about the pace?
Fast.
Were you guys keep up with it? I'm going to go over a lot of this stuff here. But I brought this for a reason. One, the attention span of young people is slow. Remember, we learn fast and deliberate. So this is trying to get to a whole, younger generation. There's also a lot of information that was passed in there. And one of the things I wanted you to realize is everything he talked about. I think Marty mentioned the Bill Gates brain magic pill, right? And then there's all these training. If you notice, none of that stuff really works. Now, the brain pill, depending upon what it does chemically, it can enhance the neural process and the richness in your brain. So there's a potential effect upon that. But what we saw here is there's a lot of training that goes on. The brain has a lot of changes in it as you age. What was one of the key things there about adults versus kids, about babies? We don't remember when we're young. Why is that? Because the brain is expanding after about age 9, and all the neural networks are being plugged with, it's like having, if you're trying to go on a road and all of a sudden you have 14,000 other streets you can go to get there. Anybody use Waze? Waze, I know how to get from here to then, all of a sudden Waze goes all these other places. Well, that's what's happening as you grow at that age. And that's why, what grade is 8 and 9? It's about 4th grade, right? So they say a lot of your effects are from the ages of 10 to 25. So what the evolutionists are doing is when the kid's brain is now most receptive, as you're taught as a young kid, you forget all that. So if you go to church, if you learn about God, all that stuff's forgotten. And now when you're ready to, start remembering stuff for your life, what's the schools taking out? God, the Word, all that stuff out. So that's why it's up to us parents at that critical time to be feeding them, because they're going to remember that. Most parents say, I did my job when they're young, now they make their own decisions. It's not, you got to do it again. So that's what we can learn from here, is that the brain is learning new stuff, and as it gathers new neurons, it forgets the old, and then as it continues to grow, now you can start doing those memory connections again. So if we summarize what we did, to do memory, you first have to encode it, then you have to store it, and then you have to bring it back. So this is what it's all about. The other thing that was significant is they didn't understand how the brain worked until the 1950s. 53, this guy had a seizure, he had seizures, removed part of his pumice, and they basically said, wow, that's where memory came from. So that's basically the state of the world right now, from 1950. Now they got more stuff confirming that, but not a whole lot more understanding of how it works. They understand the chemistry, they understand how neurons work, but they really are having a tough time understanding, because how did we start this? Where does memory and thought come from? The spirit. And you can't see, touch, or feel the spirit. So that's why it's confounding scientists, because they can't get their hands around it. And that's the one thing you heard throughout this, is they can't get their hands around it. People are trying all kinds of ways to figure it out. So this is kind of the memory process. Now if we go into, where this all comes down to and how the memory comes out, there was, declarative, there was non-declarative, there was, motory stuff, there's long-term thought stuff. So this is how the brain works from a standpoint, and we don't need to understand all this. Just say it's complicated, there's a lot going on, and if you go from an evolutionary standpoint, it's very hard how any of this could form. So he talked about episodic or semantic. In other words, events that have certain order. You remember stuff as an episode, like episode TV. Then you have structured events, memorizing facts, memorizing math stuff. So you have two kinds. And here's kind of where it breaks down to. There's sensory memory. There's short-term and long-term. There's explicit and implicit. In other words, I'm conscious of it, or it just happens. I'm sleeping, and I go on a trip. Then there's declarative facts, and then there's skills. So all this is captured in the brain, and we're going to find it's captured through the neural connections. And then we look at types of memory on a time scale, from start to end. So you have sensory memory, you have your short term, you have your in-between memory, kind of how you can do it, and then you have your long term. So all this is going in effect in the way the brain remembers, and not only does it remember, we think about that, right? Because just because you have memories, if you don't have a thought process, what does that do for you? So you're going to interact with those memories. So he mentioned this guy named Henry Mollison. And this is key, because out of this came neuroscience, right? Neural, the brain, neurons, science. So this guy created the whole idea. How does the brain work? Because they had no idea. So this guy fell down, cracked his head, was having seizures, tried all kinds of things to get rid of the seizures. So they said, let's eliminate this part of the brain. And it turned out when they eliminated that part of the brain, memories disappeared. So now all of a sudden they start saying, what happened? That's where the science came. What happened? Let's measure, find out what happened. So that was 1950. And they really haven't come up with anything new up until the last 10, 15 years. And that's because of technology being able to see into the brain as the brain's living, because basically what happened is they went and cut this guy's brain up, so they went in the head, removed that stuff, and then they started seeing how he behaved. So when he died, which was 2005 it was? 8. Short-term memory. Too much in my brain. Or, as I like to say, unimportant. So in 2008 he died, so then they split his brain up and they started looking at it through the microscope. But think about it, that was 10 years ago. Nothing's much changed until 10 years ago. Because they finally had something that they could experiment on, and now they're trying to create hypothesis. In no case has anyone tried to, how did the evolution of that happen? Because you can't. So, you know, he retained before and then afterwards. So, now, let's talk about, that's the same guy again, but this is a real good one on how we make memories.
Clive Waring was playing the piano alone in his room. When his wife came into the room, he immediately leapt up and embraced her with joyful enthusiasm. A minute later, she slipped out to grab a glass of water, and when she returned, he gave her that same bright greeting as if she'd been gone for days. And then he did it again and again. Clive was an accomplished London musician until in 1985, at the age of 47, he contracted a rare herpes encephalitis virus that ravaged his central nervous system. Since then, he's been unable to remember almost any of his past or to make new memories. His wife is the only person he recognizes, but he can never recall the last time he saw her. This may be the most profound case of extreme and chronic amnesia ever recorded. Our memory helps make us who we are, whether recognizing loved ones, recalling past joys, or just remembering how to walk and talk and fry an egg. Memory is the chain that connects our past to our present. If it breaks, we're left untethered, incapable of leaving the present moment and unable to embrace the future. But memory isn't an all-or-nothing thing, of course. Waring can't remember any details about his personal past, but he still remembers how to speak English and get dressed and play the piano. Some memories you process automatically, and they are stored differently than your more personal or factual memories, like your first kiss, or how to recite pi to 12 places, or who won the Peloponnesian War. Speaking of ancient Greeks, and to help demonstrate what I'm talking about, I want you to have a look at our Spartan friend here and remember his name, because we're going to be testing your memory in just a minute. Technically, memory is learning that has persisted over time, information that has been stored and in many cases can be recalled. Except of course during the exam, our memories are typically accessed in 3 different ways: through recall, recognition, and relearning. And if you think about all the different kinds of tests you've taken in school, they're all actually designed to size up how you access stored information in these ways. Like recall is how you reach back into your mind and bring up information just as you do in fill-in-the-blank tests. So if I say blank is the capital of Greece, your brain hopefully would just recall the answer as Athens. Recognition, meanwhile, is more like the multiple choice test. You only need to identify old information when presented with it, as in which of the following was not an ancient city in Greece: Athens, Marathon, Pompeii, or Sparta. And relearning is sort of like refreshing or reinforcing old information. So when you study for a final exam, you relearn things you half forgot more easily than you did when you were first learning them. Like, say, a basic timeline of the Greek Empire. But how? How does all of that data that we're exposed to all the time, every day, become memory? Well, in the late 1960s, American psychologists Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin figured out enough about the process of memory formation to break it down into 3 stages. First, it's encoded into the brain, then stored for future use, and then eventually retrieved. Sounds simple, but by now you've figured out that just because you take a lot of stuff about your mind for granted doesn't mean that it is not complicated. By Atkinson and Schifrin's model, we first record things we want to remember as an immediate but fleeting sensory memory. Think back to the image I showed you a minute ago. You remember his name? If you do, it's because you successfully managed to shuffle it into your short-term memory, where you probably encoded it through rehearsal. This is how you briefly remember something like a password or phone number. Like, hey Tommy, what's Jenny's number? Okay, 867-5309. 867-5309. 867-5309. You're getting it in your head there. Or in this case, I told you to remember that guy's name. Maybe you were thinking Leonidas repeatedly over and over, even if you didn't think you were doing it. But this information really only stays in your short-term memory for under 30 seconds without a lot of rehearsal. So if you weren't repeating Leonidas, you probably have forgotten it already. Because your mind, amazing as it is, can really only hold between 4 and 7 distinct bits of information at a time, at which point the memory either decays or it gets transferred into long-term memory. Long-term memory is your brain's durable and ridiculously spacious storage unit holding all of your knowledge, skills, and experiences. Now, since the days of Atkinson and Schifrin, psychologists have recognized that the classical definition of short-term memory didn't really capture all of the processes involved in the transfer of information to your long-term memory. I mean, it's more than being able to just remember some Greek guy's name, so later generations of psychologists reviewed revisited the whole idea of short-term memory and updated it to the more comprehensive concept of working memory. Working memory involves all the ways that we take short-term information and stash it in our long-term stores, and increasingly we think of it as involving both explicit and implicit processes. When we store information consciously and actively, that's an explicit process. We make the most of this aspect of working memory when we study, for instance, so that we can know that Athens is the capital of Greece and that Pompeii was a Roman town and not a Greek one. This is how we capture facts and knowledge that we think we're going to need. Like I told you, specifically to remember Leonidas's name, you concentrated on that detail and filed it away, if briefly. But of course we're not conscious of every tiny thing that we take in, yet our working memory often transfers stuff we're not aware of to long-term storage. We call that an implicit process, the kind you don't have to actively concentrate on. A good example might be classically conditioned associations, like if you get all sweaty and nervous at the dentist because you had a root canal last year. You don't need to pull up that file on the last time you got your face drilled on to think, oh, oral surgery, not my favorite. Instead, implicit processes cover all that stuff automatically. This kind of automatic processing is hard to shut off. Unless you got something unusual going on in your brain, you might not have much choice but to learn this way, like how you learned how to not put your hand into a fire. That learning would have happened pretty much automatically as soon as you first yanked your hand away from an open flame. Whether those things are lodged in there explicitly or implicitly or both, there are also different kinds of long-term memory. For instance, procedural memory refers to how we remember to do things like riding a bike or reading. It's effortful to learn at first, but eventually you can do it without thinking about it. Long-term memory can also be episodic, tied to specific episodes of your life. Like remember that time that Bernice fell out of her chair at chemistry and everybody started laughing uncontrollably? Man, good times. There are other types of long-term memory too, and we're continually learning more about the biology and psychology of the whole complex phenomenon. For instance, while Clive Waring's episodic memories, among others, seem to be deeply affected, his procedural memories for things seem to be in one piece. This has to do with neuroanatomy that we do not have time to explore here and that we don't yet fully understand. Waring and others have a lot to teach us about the different types of long-term memory storage. Now, for healthy memories, there are lots of little tricks you can use to help remember information. Mnemonics, for one, help with memorization, and I'm sure you know a few that take the form of acronyms. Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow, for instance. Mnemonics work in part by organizing items into familiar, manageable units in a process called chunking. For example, it may be hard to recall a 7-digit number, but it'll be easier to commit to memory in the rhythm of a phone number, 867-5309, or you could just write a song about it. Strategies like mnemonics and chunking can help you with explicit processes, but how well you retain your data can depend on how deep you dig through the different levels of processing. Shallow processing, for instance, lets you encode information on really basic auditory or visual levels based on the sound, structure, or appearance of a word. So if you're trying to commit the name Leonidas to your explicit memory using shallow processing, you might encode the word by recalling the cool font you saw it in. But to really retain that information, you'd want to activate your deep processing, which encodes semantically based on actual meaning associated with the word. In this case, you might remember the story of that mega tough yet very scantily clad warrior of ancient Greece. Or you might remember that Leon means lion in Greek, and that lions are tough fighters, and that Leonidas was a tough Spartan warrior king. And then to really make it stick, you want to connect it to something meaningful or related to your own personal emotional experience. Like maybe Gerard Butler's bronzed eight-pack torso and unconquerable bloodlust helped lock down the word Spartan and Leonidas in your memory forever. I mean, maybe, if that helps you. In the end, how much information you encode and remember depends on both the time you took to learn it and how you made it personally relevant to you. Memory is extremely powerful. It's constantly shaping and reshaping your brain, your life, and your identity. Clive Waring is still himself on the outside, but in his inability to recall who he was or process what has happened, he has lost some critically important part of himself. Our memories may haunt us or sustain us, but either way, they define us. Without them, we are left to wander alone in the dark. If you were committing this lesson to memory, you learned about how we encode and store in memory, the difference between implicit automatic and effortful explicit processing, how shallow and deep processing work, and a few types of long-term storage.
If you've noticed there, I've repeated it a few times so you kind of get it. Did they remember Leonidas? Did any remember the name? How did you remember it? How about you?
Same.
I just knew the history, the story.
So you had a deeper knowledge and you just placed them in there. Marty, do you remember it? No? What about you? See, I remembered it because I watched the movie 300. So I had a deep association. But if you don't have that, you have to repeat it over and over again. But if you notice, everything he talked about there, it's associations with something you have, right? So the idea being is, I know something I can add to it. Mnemonics. I know something I can add to it. Everything is associated. So as you're 9, 10, 11 years old and your brain is expanding, you're starting to get more information. Now you're starting to make these neural networks. The neural networks is the way the brain works. It makes connections. And if you do the connections over and over and over and over again, you have the memory. If you retrieve them over and over and over again, they become more ingrained because it's developing a stronger connection. And then if you don't go back for a while, it takes a while to regurgitate that. And it's all a chemical process. You know, you're creating these neural networks, they get connected, they get pulled back, and then some people have better than others. And now they're saying there's brain chemistry that can help that by getting rid of a lot of the pollutants and whatnot. So what you basically have now is a brain that grows and continues to grow through your adulthood. And then they don't know what's dementia, Alzheimer's and all that, but it seems you forget to be able to pull these things back. And they're still trying to figure out. But if you noticed, there hasn't been a lot of breakthroughs, right? 1950, this guy loses his memory, and then in 86, 87, this other guy had this problem, but there hasn't been a whole lot of breakthroughs because they can't see it, they can't touch it, they can't feel it. So does everybody know what an MRI machine is? If you do research, I didn't want to get into a lot of the, boring details, but what they're now doing is they're taking and creating with mice and other humans, they try to create memories, and then they do an MRI to see where the activity in your brain is. You know, the neural networks are creating electricity, they create blood flow creates heat, so they can start seeing where the brain does these things. But they still don't get it. They don't know how it works. And it always amazes me that we evolved from nothing, and we still can't figure out how the brain works, and yet it works amazingly, right? Just that it works alone is amazing, and yet there are people that think, without thinking, that it just happened. And I'll just add millions of years. Now, the older we get, the memories fade. So how do you put that into evolution? The older you get, the worse it goes, but yet, the older it is, the better it gets. I don't get it. But that's what science, evolutionary, says. But then you get some science like this that is not as easy to define and model, and the whole evolution thing falls apart. And this is just to equip you guys to say, okay, let's talk about evolution. Let's talk about man from ape. How do you deal with this? And just go through the processes, how the brain works. Because I was talking to a friend today, the politics is getting pretty fervent these days. And I always take no position. I just ask the questions. Because what you want to do is have people explore what they've taken as truth and have them think through it. And what you'll usually find is when you corner them to where they can't come up with an answer, they either make fun of it or they change the topic. But we have to be prepared to explain and help them see, like Rob says, every person you run into, if they're fervently against God, it's an opportunity because the real enemy is Satan behind them. So we have to educate them. So there's a lot going on in the brain. And here is, I've been watching this for the last years. So this is 2017 January. MIT was doing a study. And what they were able to do is, you can't read this, but they were looking at neural circuits in the process that memories are formed simultaneously in the hippocampus and long-term storage, the cortex. So at first, back in the 1950s and 1980s, they thought, it starts in your core of your brain and then gets stored in all that stuff outside. Well, they're finding by able to, mark where these memories are, it's all in that main core, right? Right from the spinal cord, right in that first part where everything spreads out, it all stores right there. Which gets back to what they found in 1953. When they cut that part out, his memories disappeared. So they come up with models, and then they come back to the basics. And if you think about the hypothalamus and all that, the cortex right there, that's where God, if you want to say he makes us all breathe without thinking, he makes our heart breathe, or beat, it's all from God. All of that's from God, and all this other stuff does other things, but we still can't figure that out. So the conclusion, we can ask questions is, as I always like to say, it's amazing how this stuff works. Take a chemical out, you break a neuron, you have something get in between the neurons, it doesn't work. You pollute the brain, you forget. It changes when you're 8, 9 years old, everyone forgets it. And then it reforms again. And yet, evolution says it always builds upon the next, upon the next, upon the next. It's wonderfully made. It's amazing how this stuff works. It's amazing how we can have thought. It's amazing how we can communicate. It's amazing how we can remember stuff. And it works perfectly, from the small child to the oldest adult. It's amazing how that works. So the question is, could it have evolved? I say no. The Bible says no. And on memory, man can't figure it out. And we're the smartest thing in the world, right? You figure by now they'd have some smart people figure that out. So we're made in his image. Now we can look at what's future's going on. They're talking about, and I had this in kind of, man's trying to become immortal. You hear, I don't know if you read any of the newspapers, but you've got all these high-tech giants in Silicon Valley. They're all trying to spend all this money to, live forever, have pills to, help the brain function better, maybe place memories of yourself into a chip or something else. So man is trying to duplicate this. He's trying to go against the forces of nature. And there's many things that are going to get in the way of that, but I just go back to what Jesus said, as in the days of Noah. Then look for him coming back. And we're at that point right now. So are there any questions? This is kind of a high-level view. There's a lot of science that we could get into. If you want to go search online, there's how all this stuff works, how the neurons store. But it's basically, you take the neuron, you just connect them. The more it's connected, the more you go through that process, you call it back, it gets stronger. If you, at a certain point in time, it becomes permanent. But if you don't access it, you have to, go back and reprogram your brain to retrieve that. And some people are better than others. That's a gift of God. But the point of it is, there's a lot of soup that goes into this, and yet it works wonderfully. It works perfectly. For everybody. Not just a select few, for everybody.